Mr. Rainwater, today we are talking about Talkin, which might be the most.
Talking about talking. I like
This
it.
might be the most meta episode yet, but today we're talking about dialogue in storytelling. I don't know if you could technically say there's dialogue in art, right? Because I mean, if you would perceive art as just like a still painting or something, there's not usually
Yeah.
a caption bubble, a dialogue bubble, right? That's more
Not really.
comics
Yeah,
oriented, but then
I would put that in comics. Sometimes in illustration you can see it, but yeah, I would say dialogue belongs pretty strictly to the written word, and
yeah,
movies are largely, in a lot of ways, not necessarily always, but often extensions of the written word, because they start from scripts, right? And so this sort of this helps create that connection, if you will, where dialogue is often a major part. Not of every film, obviously. There are a lot of movies I like that have no dialogue often,
really,
or very little dialogue. Like Wall-E is one of my favorite Pixar movies because, like, the first, I don't know, like 30, 45 minutes, seems like 30, 45 minutes for a while.
yeah,
There's pretty much no dialogue, and it's just you're learning about Wall-E's life. Um, or 2001: A Space Odyssey, another one. Very little dialogue, and when the dialogue shows up, it's for very specific purposes because information needs to be given in regards to what's going on in the story. But within that film, Kubrick tries to tell the majority of the story just visually. But sometimes there are things you can't explain visually. Like sometimes there are conceptual elements to a story that require conversation between two people. And I don't know if you have any particular examples that you can think of
well,
off the top of your hand.
three things that you hit on there that I want to point out. The number one,
Yeah.
which is the funny thing, which was for a half a second there, I thought you were talking about Kubrick directing Wall-E, and that would have been an entirely different movie. First of all, secondly, I think the silence that you were talking about, and then it moving into the dialogue happening for a reason is actually something very important, that dialogue needs to happen for a reason. It shouldn't just be talking. I hear a lot of amateur storytellers talk about, well, that's realistic, that's real life. And what they're mistaking is when they hear that kind of dialogue in a film, that is the style that is being used. It is not the actual mundane, scatterbrained, loose, not thought out, not for a purpose speech pattern.
And there's a lot of people who see Quentin Tarantino movies and assume that the quote unquote naturalistic dialogue in those movies are simply that, when a lot of times the conversations are part of a bigger theme that you have to kind of put together over the course of the story.
Right.
So and Tarantino's kind of a master of that sort of thing. He's had a lot of practice with it. Not everybody's going to be great at it. But what was the last thing that you were saying, Jow, in regards? I kind of interrupted you a bit.
No, that's fine. There was, oh shit, what was the third point? Now I lost it. But I'm sure I'll come back to it. But to answer your question about my observations of dialogue, that's one of the things that I get praised for a lot in my work. A lot of people talk about my dialogue being very naturalistic and everything, and I, honest to God, I couldn't tell you that I go in intentionally with that. I just have that knack. It's like a third gear where I can just kick into it, and I know if it sounds right or not. I think it's because I'm a control freak, but there is a approach that I do take when I'm reevaluating it, because I'm a big staunch supporter of writing is rewriting. So when I'm rewriting something, I'm evaluating what I've already written, and I'm looking at it from the angle of what is being done with this dialogue. I don't look at dialogue as dialogue. I look at dialogue as another action. So, even within action itself, there are different forms of action. You can have two characters pointing guns at each other, and you can have two characters having sex. That's both action, both for entirely different reasons.
Yeah.
I look at dialogue as another form of that action. So I would put dialogue, a Mexican standoff, and an orgy all in the same vein of purpose in storytelling. It is just another form of action to do something. So when I do it, I usually come into it with the mindset of the basic motivating factor of any kind of good storytelling, which is a character wants something, and the dialogue is a tool that they are using to get it. That's basically what it is, and that will start narrowing down to me what needs to stay, what needs to go, when I'm starting to veer in the wrong tangent, because sometimes I will get into that, artsy fartsy mode where I just want to fucking monologue about my gripe with something, and it's out of place. It does not belong in the scene. Hell, it might even not belong in the film or the story or whatever it is that I'm trying to tell. I need to stay on point. I need to make sure that I'm with the character in that moment. And the best way to do that is also to look at the other characters in the scene and point them in the opposite direction. They want the opposite thing, or they, you know what I mean? Like, they have to be in conflict. It's another form of, it's basically, again, for a bad analogy that I keep reusing, it's a gun. It's just another way of doing that.
It's interesting too, because listening to you talk about that, I'm having some other thoughts in regard to that too, which is that, so dialogue, like you're saying, one of its main purposes is to explain, or not explain, but to have a character get what they want, right?
Yes.
That was the first thing that you start with.
Yep.
It can also be a way of describing a character without having a narrator, right?
True.
Describe the character. You start a movie off, and you watch your main character having a conversation, possibly with a random person, possibly with a supporting character, possibly whoever. Within that exchange, you get to learn more about motivations of the character. You get to learn about their personality. You get to learn about all the aspects that you're kind of preparing for as you get into the rest of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
For some reason, I thought that there was a third purpose to dialogue. I mean, I would say to a certain extent, and then the big one and the one that is often warned about is like exposition, to explain things that are going on. Sometimes, every once in a while, you kind of need it, right? But it's figuring out how to do that without making it a complete mess. And I'm wondering, Jow, if you have any ideas or good examples that come to your mind in regards to that particular.
Off the top of my head, in terms of examples, I don't have any, but I know this is the solution that I commonly look at when it comes to exposition. Do both of these characters already know this? That is the big question you need to ask yourself when you're reevaluating your dialogue. If it's like, hey, Rainwater, I'm so glad you're coming on my podcast, Midnight at the Spaghetti Factory. You already fucking know the title of the podcast is Midnight at the Spaghetti Factory. There's no reason for me to say that out loud to you. So automatically, I think that that's part of the key. And the other key to unlocking whether or not your exposition is bad is... oh shit, I just lost my train of thought. Hold on, I'm going to get it back. The first thing you got to do is make sure that both people don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
The second thing, is very clearly, it's the same thing that has to do with when you use like magic or some kind of extravagant plot device or something like that. You have to maintain the illusion for your audience. You cannot pull them out of the story. So if your dialogue gets very wordy and clunky and it seems like a run-on sentence or whatever like that, including monologues, if your monologue is not tight, your audience will step back and be like, wow, this is a pretty big monologue. And the moment they think that, they're not in the movie, they're not in the moment, in the scene, in whatever's happening anymore, and you've ruined it. So the key there is the stylistic execution of that. And going back to the information thing that I was talking about, where both characters know this thing already, that's actually an attribute to you to withhold that information from the audience because you're building mystery. Now, granted, that can be taken to extremes to the point where an audience will tune out and be like, I don't know what the fuck is going on. That is another key that's really rooted in dialogue is you have to find a delicate balance of how much can I tell them so that they're staying with me, they know what's going on, they understand what's happening, but they don't know, they're not getting spoon-fed things that characters already know, and they're not figuring out what's going to happen. So you have to know self-restraint as an artist when you're working with your dialogue.
Absolutely.
That's the big part.
It's just something that, kind of going back to more stuff about sci-fi, some of my favorite sci-fi novels, there's not a lot of action that goes on in them. But because the point of the novel is that you find out more and more about the world through conversations that take place between characters. So you start off with like, okay, what the hell is all this terminology that they're using? Like, what's a jinx conductor or whatever, you know? And over the course of the story, it becomes more and more, apparent as you see the dialogue, as you see those terms and all those ideas being used repeatedly through dialogue, you start to learn, and it becomes sort of like it becomes a lived experience almost. So dialogue, when done well, can be such a great way to captivate an audience and be in a situation where they feel like they're living within that world.
Yeah.
And it's something that I try and do myself in Trailer Park Warlock, and something that I often do get compliments on is people really like the characters. And, people ask, how do you build good characters? And, there are a lot of different places to start, right? We were talking with Erin for last week's episode, and one of her main concerns were about, the external look of that character and how their wardrobe and how you immediately take in all the information about them can give you so much immediate information about who they are. And then the next brick or the next block in building that character is seeing how they talk to other people and how they themselves converse, or what kind of language that they use, what kind of words do they use. Do they speak eloquently? Do they speak, kind of like street tough, or are they just very plain spoken? There's all sorts of different ways that you can create all those particular characteristics from the words that they use. And so I was wondering, do you have any insight in regards to that in terms of making good dialogue for a character, even just starting with an individual character?
I mean, if you look from it's very easy. Like, a lot of people think, well, I don't know how to define characters. So like when I go to my writers group, there's a group of screenwriters that I work with, and a lot of them will write the way they talk, and it's just their dialogue and it's their words. And I try to explain to them, I'm like, okay, what we need to do is we need to black out the name, because I'm working with screenplays. We need to black out the name and then read the dialogue. And if I can't tell who is talking,
absolutely,
then you have a problem with how you're defining your character. So like, if you take a list of, I don't want to call them archetypes, but we'll call them archetypes for the sake of not spinning wheels here trying to figure out what to call them, but like character types. And I list them out to you. So I made a little list here. If I gave you this list, you should be able to come up with a way that these characters all talk differently. So you have a professor, a bad boy next door, a cat lady, a elderly martial arts master, a geek, a pirate, a town drunk, a wealthy business tycoon, a tomboy, a zombie, and a jock athlete sports type. If you put all those characters into a circle, it's not hard to figure out ways to do that. Now, I must warn you, when you start looking at it like that, it's very easy to venture into stereotype.
Oh, sure.
because people will look at a jock and be like, okay, he's dumb. And that's one way you can look at it, because that is that is a character type, and if you're writing a comedy, it's easy to go that way. But it's also within that character's wheelhouse to constantly be competitive, and a lot of people don't take that route, and it's like, oh well, I could just have him trying to figure out how to win the argument. And it's like, well, you're not trying to win the argument. Or the drunk is just being a smartass and keeps talking and won't ramble. And, there's just different ways that these characters will approach things. And then once you start figuring out what that character is, you'll start understanding what their motivation is. And then you'll start figuring out the way that they talk. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you were bringing up sort of the issue about stereotyping, right? And for me, I look at that and I think, well, those are very interesting opportunities for creativity, because you can start to think about how to break those stereotypes.
Sure.
Or in a lot of ways, you can break them in ways of creating dialogue with them that's sort of that can be surprising to people.
Sure.
Like, let's say you have a jock type, but the jock type might talk
dainty,
perhaps more intellectually.
Or dainty, or if he talks dainty.
Yeah, dainty. I like that a
like
lot.
That's you know what I mean? Like, all of a sudden you got this guy with giant shoulders and he's got his jersey on or whatever like that, and then he starts talking very high and he kind of sounds like a valley girl, and it's like, oh, that goes, you know what I mean? And that's when I think we would take what Aaron was talking about last week with the costume design, and then you take the dialogue and you contrast those things. So if you're designing a comedy, bingo, there you go. You have two pre-established stereotypes and you clash them, and that's what creates the mood, or the, you know what I mean?
That's the secret sauce.
Absolutely. So I'm curious to know for you, for dialogue, because you're doing Trailer Park Warlock, which is like magic and things of that nature, right? So how do you handle some of the exposition that's dealt with that? Do you know what I mean? Because you're not all, again, I'm a bad friend and a bad co-podcaster. I have not read it yet, but I'm probably of the mind that at least some of the stuff, the magic in it, is made up by you, probably influenced by real life things, but made up by you. So when you're designing things like that, do you have to come up with ways to explain how that spell works, or how this magic, item does this or whatever like that? How do you go about that?
I've actually, in writing that story, I've actually made one of the main premises of the overall story to be like learning about how it works over the course of time. So when you start off in the story, you really don't know how anything works. It all seems very absurd and ridiculous, and it's supposed to be that way, and it's supposed, for purposes of humor. And certainly a lot of stuff does stay that way because I want to keep that humor. Mm-hmm. But over time, there are little, like, the main character, Jake, learns more and more and more about sort of how all these things in this world works, because he's coming from the perspective of just being like the day laborer equivalent of a magician. He's just like, he only has the basic knowledge that he needs to get his job done. And those jobs are often just like the basic shit. And there's this whole other world outside of him that goes way beyond it, to the point that it's like he realizes how small he is in all of it. And so for me, that became the fun of telling the story, is having this world sort of slowly open up, and you find out more and more about what the understructure of all this is, to a certain extent. I'm never, like, at the end of the story, not everything's going to be explained, Yeah. But there's going to be enough explained that you can go, oh, okay, I get how this works. And so for me, I see exposition almost as like a reward, kind of. Yeah. For getting into further chapters of the story, instead of like as the necessary part for telling the story. Because in my mind, the crucial part of the story is the character relationships. Because those are the things that change in a way that, to me, are more meaningful, over the course of the story are like how Jake as a character develops, what changes in his life. Those to me seem like the central core aspects. So all that stuff I do, you know, largely through conversations that take place before I have like some gags, right? Because like a lot of times dialogue is a delivery system for gags. Sometimes there are jokes or puns or setups, that happen in dialogue that later on will pay off either through an action or some other dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I look at it as I look at the magic as this background element of the story, but the foreground element is how all these characters interact with each other, largely because I'm just kind of in love with the characters to a certain extent.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, I mean, I think all writers want to be in that position, right? Because that's where the best dialogue comes from. That's where you end up like doing the best work, right? That's also where you end up writing, like you were talking about earlier, like, pages and pages of dialogue that most of it won't get used, in the final cut. But I'm wondering if you did say something similar to that earlier, but I wonder if you had more thoughts in regards to that and how to, like, when you have an overabundance of dialogue, how do you weed through that to get to the good stuff, the cream of the crop?
It goes back to that mindset of just giving them just enough to keep up, so that they're not tuning out to be like, I don't know what's going on, I give up. Because I've found the audience will wait for the quote unquote big reveal by the end. Do you know what I mean? Like if as long as you don't hammer it enough and pin so many story points on what is actually being talked about that they don't know about or understand, they will wait to find out why. So like when you're watching like a murder mystery movie, everybody's trying to figure out who it is, but no one is trying to figure out why this person is doing it, right? I mean, they'll build into that and be like, oh, that guy's daughter got hit by a car. That would be a good reason for him to do it. I think he did it, and da-da-da-da-da. But that's just like, baseline justification kind of mindset. They're just trying to figure out, and they've already looked at the actor and said, that guy looks creepy, I think he did it. And then they're trying to like backwards engineer why. And so that's how it does. But for me, it's about that idea of giving and withholding. Because if I'm watching Back to the Future and Doc is explaining to Marty about how the flux capacitor or the time travel machine works in the first 10 minutes of the movie, that works because that's introducing us to the magic of the movie and how it's going to work. But if Doc is explaining to Marty about how the time machine works, and then he goes into a long diatribe about how Marty can't interfere with his parents falling in love because then he'll never exist and he'll start erasing himself from time and da-da-da. That's not the time or place for it. Do you know what I'm saying? That is strategically placed at a certain point. So it was like you were saying, where you kind of reveal as the story goes on more and more and more about it. I think that slow burn, the audience will wait as long as they've got enough to keep them understanding the concept of what's going on, what each character wants in the scene. Then it becomes tolerable. That's the key.
Absolutely.
I've had to deal with that when I was writing Haunted. It's a big, hard, difficult thing for me because at its core, it's a mystery movie. For those of the listeners who haven't tuned in before and heard me give this spiel, it's just a girl who goes on one of those Halloween haunts in the middle of the woods on Halloween, but there's a rumor that they might actually be killing people along this trail, and that they set up plants, like actors staged in the tour groups, to be quote-unquote killed off. So when she goes, I have a very delicate task at hand of juggling character to make you care about the other characters in the group, but also ride that fine line of a double entendre type deal where anything they could say could go either way. Where it's like, oh, this is an authentic person actually on the tour, or this person has a motivation trying to get me to pull that lever so that the spikes will pop out and then someone dies. So it's, you know what I mean? Like it's one of those things where you have to really be on your game and really kind of look at, and I go back to it, what those characters want. And it's important for you, the storyteller, to know what they want, and maybe not the audience, but the audience will start to figure it out. And that's what keeps you on the edge of your seat when you're writing a dialogue scene, is you know what one person wants, particularly your main character, and maybe you don't know what the other person wants. And that's something, that's a task for you as an audience member. I'm glued, man. Like, that's what gets me into a story.
That creates tension immediately.
Yep.
No, it doesn't matter what the situation is. It doesn't even have to be like a horrifying or dramatic or suspenseful one. It could just be having a conversation with a random stranger on the street and sort of suddenly having a notion of, I'm not sure why this person's having this conversation with me. Why are we still talking about this?
Yeah.
And, ratchet up from there.
Absolutely.
But
I think that the to boil it down to a simple answer to your question, I think placement comes into a big thing. So like structure comes into play. That's like the big thing. So we talked about the Blake Snyder format. And as much as I worship that man and his books, the Save the Cat series, there are times I disagree with him. And that's my prerogative as an artist. That's creative license. So like in his theory about structure, he talks about theme. Theme is one of those expository things that gets shoveled out in dialogue constantly, that people get beat over the head with it. And that's when that's when it turns into preaching. And that's when people really tune out of your fucking story. But I think of his storytelling thing where he's like, okay, page 5, you got to lay in the theme somehow so people start knowing what this is about and they get it. I disagree. Because I was watching the other day, Creed, the first movie with Michael B. Jordan, Sylvester Stallone. There is no theme pinpointed at all through the majority of the movie. And Ryan Coogler saved it. He was the writer-director for the very end of the movie, when Michael B. Jordan is fighting his big rival guy at the end of the movie, and he's going it, and Rocky Balboa is like, I'm going to call off this fight, and it's over. I should have called it off for your dad. I'm going to call it off for you. And Michael B. Jordan's like, no, I got to prove it. What the hell are you talking about? Proof what? Like, this has not been a theme that we've been running through the entire time. And he goes, I got to prove that I'm not a mistake. And at that moment, like right now, I have goosebumps on my arm, because that was the right moment for him to reveal that theme. And he did it in dialogue. It didn't feel forced. They set up the entire movie that Rocky felt terrible that he did not save Apollo's life in the fight with Ivan Drago. He set up before that Michael B. Jordan's character, Apollo Creed, was not saying this in a slanderous way, but a bastard son. He was the product of cheating on his wife. Apollo cheated on his wife, and that's what led to Adonis being born. And so for his whole life, he's kind of looked at as this little bastard child of a star, a stain on the great Creed legacy and this and that. And the entire time, we never really question why he wants to be a boxer. He's just wanting to do it, and we kind of swallowed it, like right from the start, because they set it up that he's just fighting. Right from the very first scene, he's in a fight in the juvie. And it just carries through the movie. We never question it. And then at the end of the movie, it's like, well, why is he fighting? I never even thought to ask that question. But that's when they laid out the theme, and it was the perfect moment for it.
I have a question in regards to that. What I'm wondering is, do you think that the fact that it is a story that's part of a broader line of stories might be the reason why it would be easier to do, to display the theme that much later in the film? Do you think that has any impact on that point of revelation? I
don't know if it's because it's part of a franchise. I think it's more so because it's a genre movie. It's as soon as you watch the trailer, you're like, okay, it's a boxing movie. Well, our main character has to want to box. And you know what I mean? Like so you just kind of swallow it with the dramatic premise of what genre you're stepping into.
Sure.
You know what I mean? It's like nobody really asks, well, why did they make a theme park full of dinosaurs? You know what I'm saying? Like, nobody really asks that question. Why would you do that? Especially because when we meet John Hammond, the dude is not like a money hungry thieving evil businessman. He's literally here like, oh no, everyone should be able to see these animals. And
yeah, I mean, he's basically Santa Claus in the movie in a
yeah,
lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, they do reveal the theme, his motivation later on when he's talking about the flea show with Ellie Sattler and they're eating Jello or whatever, but nobody questions it. You know what I mean? It's one of those.
By the way, like a fantastic bit of dialogue, right? Because it's just this. I mean, he's telling the story to her, and over the course of the story that he's telling, it's like you do finally realize what his whole. I mean, basically, you were just saying this, but what his whole motivation is for the whole movie.
Right.
It's not necessarily the theme of the movie, but it's like the why done it basically at that point. Going back to one of the genres we talked about in a previous episode. And when you finally have that motivation, it gives a counterpoint to all the horror that's happened previously in the movie, right? You suddenly are having this pause of like, oh, he wasn't motivated in any malicious way at all. He just really wanted to bring joy to people's lives, and he was like, this is the way to do it.
And that's one of the things where I think this dialogue gets overlooked when people talk about making your villains don't think that they're the villain of the story. They always think that they're the hero. So if there is a true villain in Jurassic Park, I mean, yeah, you could point the finger at Newman and assume that he's the villain because he shut off the gates and the power and all that. He was trying to steal the DNA. Sure, he does villainous things. But the antagonist here is John Hammond, even down to the end, because right when they get into Dr. Grant gets back to the group, he's got a shotgun, and they're talking about the velociraptors breaking through the door, and John Hammond's screaming at him over the phone, "Don't shoot them! Fuck you! The dinosaurs are gonna kill us, like, and your grandchildren." And you know what I mean? Like that's one of those like fine points that's like stone in John Hammond, is that these animals are creatures and they're living things and they're beautiful and everyone deserves to do them. And if that was never answered, if that story about the fleas and stuff like that was never given, you would be like, this man is just fucking crazy, which is also a possibility. You don't have to reveal that information, but if you want to create realistic characters, you want the motivations to be understandable. People watch The Dark Knight, and a lot of people are like, the Joker is so fucking on point, because those dialogues that he gives to Harvey Dent in the hospital, or the interrogation scene with Batman, he's making a case for his motivation, and he's arguing. And it comes back to a point that we were talking about earlier. Dialogue should be about confrontation. You know what I mean? And that's the best time to reveal character, motivation, theme, all that kind of stuff is through confrontation, which is why I like to look at dialogue as an action, a form of action. It's another form of conflict that needs to be done. So to boil it down, once again, to answer your question, how do I go about eliminating dialogue that's not necessary? Each scene is about one direct conflict. One. It can't be more than one. Yeah. And it's got to be pertaining to that particular conflict. That's it.
So I have a question. Do you personally ever use dialogue specifically for like, oh, I want to deliver a certain character trait right now, or like I want to, like the conversation doesn't necessarily do anything for the plot or the conflict or the theme. You know what I mean? But it's something that like I really want this characteristic to be understood about this character before we move on. So just going on with that question, have you done that, or is that something that how do you feel about that?
It goes back to one of our earlier podcasts, because I think this is another thing that is very important when it comes to dialogue, is setups and payoffs. If I'm doing something, if I'm establishing something for a character through dialogue, it might come off expository. But the reason that I'm doing it is because it's going to pay off later for some kind of action that they take. So you know what I'm saying? Like if it seems superfluous now, then I have to justify it later. You know what I mean?
For sure.
Leonardo DiCaprio can't be talking about his flamethrower movie for no fucking reason.
Exactly.
That flamethrower's coming back into play later. And you talked about
Right.
that, you know what I mean? Like the setups and payoffs. And that's why that has to be there. And that's why Tarantino, you know, was giving a masterclass. And he's, like you said before, he's always, always, always revered about his dialogue. And that's not because it's quote unquote realistic. It's because he motivates it in ways that are necessary. Because if you're using dialogue, there's 5 ways you can use dialogue: for story information, for character, tone, setting the scene, and the theme. Those are like the 5 ways to use dialogue.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You can set a scene by walking in and have a character just go, so this is creepy. And you immediately have set the scene for the audience. They're almost echoing like an audience's mindset sometimes. And it's almost like a back and forth between the filmmaker and the audience. It's like, okay, we know what you're thinking. And that's when the audience goes, shit, you're in my head? And they start stammering. And then they're like, well, if you know I'm thinking that, then you're going to be smarter than me. Like, you know what I mean? Because I don't know what a filmmaker's thinking right off the bat when I'm watching a movie. They're in my head. I'm not in theirs unless I've seen their filmography and I know their shtick. Their director trademark by that point.
Martin Scorsese mobster movie, you know, might be a good example of that, where it's like, okay, I know what to expect here. I know what we're getting into. But that is also like a particular... it's a particular flavor of movie you might be in the mood for at a given point. But they're also very dialogue-heavy movies, too, and ones that are built heavily on character interaction, where it is like a constant... You're constantly building up to some moment, and usually that moment is murder, like, a lot of the time. But the murder is, like, kind of ancillary to the fact of, in those movies, you're learning something about this group, or you're learning something about this particular system or institution.
Yep.
And going back to having an actual question in regard to this ramble, I suppose, do you have any movies that you would pinpoint as being your favorite dialogue type movies?
I mean, I'm such a fucking fanboy, but the Scream movies, man. Like, I know you already said you haven't watched them, so I'm trying to tread very carefully here.
Not yet. I'm gonna get into them at some point, though.
Well, the Scream 5 comes out in January, so you better get on it. You got 4 flicks to watch before then. But that might be viewing to save for like October, like right around Halloween. That's probably a good franchise to jump into. But so without giving anything away, even though I think I have to use sometimes before, and I'm sure you've probably absorbed through like osmosis some of the stuff that happens in the Scream movies. But either way, it's basically a hunt for a murderer most of the movie. Yeah. And when you get to the end of the movie, ta-da, here's the murderer. And then they give this giant expository brain dump of why they did it. And the back and forth of those movies is the conflict is what I'm talking about. Again, the conflict and the dialogue, it suddenly doesn't become about surviving for the protagonist. It becomes an argument about why you're wrong. It's a duel of philosophy. So it elevates beyond the survival technique, because I mean, we want the main character to live. We want the killer to be arrested or killed or whatever it may be. But we want the philosophy of the protagonist to succeed over the antagonist, because the antagonist has a flawed philosophy and they're going to make their case at the end. And it's the same thing with even Dark Knight. You look at the Joker hanging upside down and he's talking about him and Batman, and it's like, me and you are the same two people on different sides of the coin, baby. Yeah. We're going to do this forever, and nothing's ever going to change that. And Batman's like, no, we're going to change that because I'm done. Harvey Dent's going to take over. And Joker's like, really? Yeah, that's your boy? That's your boy? Guess what I did? And you know what I mean? And that's when that dialogue is like, oh, shit, what did he do now? Like, and that's the fun of it, is that duel. That duel of philosophy is what makes it good. Because if you're a human being, you can see someone's point. It's debate club.
Exactly. Right.
And that's what
Absolutely.
makes great villains, and that's what makes great movies. Or stories, I should say. But for me, it's movies. So I'm curious to know from you, working in a visual medium for storytelling, how hard is it for you? Because I know, as any artist or storyteller may be, monologues. God, we all love to monologue. We like to rant. But you have a problem of page length. Like, you know what I mean? If I'm doing a scene, I can cut between 3 different angles. I can cut to other people. I can cut away to a parallel action or something like that. I mean, I guess you could in a comic. But for you, if you're doing a monologue, you have not only the art on the page, but you also have the dialogue bubble, and you have to fill that up. So, like, how is it, dealing with that kind of an issue where you have physical limitations, technically, to the amount of dialogue that you can deliver in one particular scene? I mean, I got to imagine it forces you to be concise, right?
I've become very conscious about how I use dialogue or monologue or words in general, because I am drawing all the pictures that are going to end up being covered by my fucking word balloons. So
yeah, that's exactly what I'm curious about.
There's a point when I'm lettering where I'm just like, I went too long on this sentence. I spent all this time on this, like, can opener in the background. Now I'm just gonna cover it up. That has actually made me really conscious about how concise my dialogue should be. Or I say should. I try and keep it more on the concise side. Not that I think it should always be that way. Like, sometimes, you want to have dialogue that goes on a little bit. I wrote a panel for an episode I just recently finished where it's probably one of the longest dialogue balloons, and I knew it was going to be a long dialogue balloon. So I made this big panel, and I made most of it empty space except for the 2 characters talking to each other. So, like, I prepared myself for it. I was like, this is all going to get covered up in dialogue. So fuck it, but I don't do that too often. That doesn't happen too often. I just make sure that I'm aware, of it. And it's a factor of comics making. So there's a term in comics called, I'm probably going to get it totally wrong, but I want to say it's called headspace or balloon space or something like that. And it's basically defining when you're composing shots or you're composing panels, you want to make sure that you're composing in such a way that there is room specifically towards, the top, but anywhere between the middle or between the top and the middle of the panel, there's just open space, because that space is going to be taken up with word balloons if there's if there's conversation happening. Yeah. It's a graphic design challenge. It comes with the territory, and it's one that I don't often run into so bad as I used to. Like, I know, so here's an interesting detail. When I did work with a writer, so like on Garage Raja, I worked with Austin Price. There were times where I was like, we gotta change this panel, because there's like too much talking, and there's too many visual details that we need to like show in this panel that I think are more important than the conversations that are happening. So, like, we often would have, pauses, timeouts, where it's like, hold on, let's go back, let's rework this scene. If you want to keep all this dialogue, which, 9 times out of 10, that dialogue probably needed to be there because it was either important to the plot or important to, giving more definition to the characters or whatever. But there was a lot of back and forth between me and him. And this happens a lot of times with artist-writer teams, where it's just like, you have to have that back and forth of, especially if a writer is newer to the format, because 9 times out of 10, if a writer has never drawn a comic, they don't think about it at all. It's just, They're just like, I can write whatever I want.
Not my problem.
Exactly. And it ends up destroying the page. So my word of advice to people who are working in comics, and especially writers, if you are a writer who is coming from either film or television and you're like writing for comics, fucking draw a comic. Just draw a comic. I don't care if you're using stick figures or whatever. Draw a comic and understand like the graphic design process you're about to get into. Because the last thing any artist is going to want is like, you know, a long description of a panel with shit tons of detail, and then you have like 6 or 7 word balloons describing this, you know, ornate process or whatever. Like, that's not how you tell us a comic book story. It's a back and forth between word and picture, and you have to have the two complement each other, and you have to do it in a way that you're neither getting too bored with the pictures and you're neither getting too bored with the words. There's a rhythm to it that takes time to learn, and it takes a lot of practice. So anyway, Jow, I would say, do you have any further advice for somebody, let's say for a comic artist who might be getting into screenwriting, or let's say a graphic designer who might be, you know, writing a script for film or television?
Well, I mean, the general principles always apply. You know, drop somebody into the middle of a conversation versus starting it from, "Hi, Matt. Hi, Jow. Hi. How you doing? Great weather today, right? Yeah. How you doing? How's the kids? Oh, they're good." Like, no one gives a shit. Cut all that out. Cut to, "You're doing what? You're gonna kill my mom?" Like that's where you enter the conversation. There's a little bit more of a, you have to be a psychiatrist when you're a screenwriter. And that might be the same kind of appliance that when you're a comic writer and you're dealing with the artist is drawing and you're the writer, but it's the same mentality of, all right, if I'm not directing this and I'm not the actor reading this, I have to do everything I can to lay in subtext to get them to do exactly what I want them to do without them knowing it, because they're going to fuck it up or try and be artsy fartsy and say, "Oh, we're going to do this different. Oh, blah, blah, blah." Like Christopher Walken goes through screenplays and he removes all of the punctuation. And that's how he goes about reading his dialogue. He reads the dialogue as he wants to. He doesn't care if you put a comma here or not. He is just going to read it the way he wants to read it. So when you're writing things like, goes past dialogue, but if you're going in like action balloons in a screenplay thing or whatever, you have to understand that you have to combat the other artists that you're working with. And speak on a more primal subtextual level so that they end up doing what you want them to do.
Oh, yeah. I get what you're saying.
There's a whole lot of psychiatry that goes in. So like if you're writing for a comic, generally you're probably working with one artist. Like, I mean, granted, there's inkers and colorists that go beyond it and everything like that, but you're working with one artist who's going to lay that out, and then they're going to figure out stuff from beyond that. So you don't really have to...
For sure, the penciler is the main person you're working with, who could either make... They're the other person who's going to make it succeed, the largest percentage, or they're the one who's going to fuck it up, the largest percentage.
Right. But when you're writing for either film or not television, well, television, yeah, or like a stage play, you are dealing with dozens of actors, the director, and you have to wonder, are they going to change this? Are they going to change the intent of this? Are they going to change? Robert Downey Jr. doesn't like to kind of listen to the words. Seth Rogen and his little band of merry men like to improv when they're doing it. Now, granted, they write most of the scripts that they perform, but they are open to improv. And when you're writing things like dialogue, you got to be on fucking point, man. Like, if you know who you're dealing with sometimes, and most of the time you don't know who you're going to end up dealing with, but you got to be on point. And there's certain people who respect the written word that's written down there, and they'll perform it as they understand it. And that's the big thing, is laying in the context so that the artist is understanding what they're portraying, so that the audience understands what you're portraying. Does that make sense? Because
Yes.
if the actor doesn't know what the hell they're saying, like you go back, I was watching Star Wars today, and one of the behind the scenes things that they talk about all the time is nobody talks like this. I don't know what the hell a Naviconverter is or a Death Star when they're filming. Nobody had any idea what George Lucas was fucking talking about when he was talking about parsecs and this and that, but they had to deliver it as if they did know. So it was really important to, I guess, for George Lucas, his direction was always faster and more intense, but I guess in a way he kind of kept them on a leash, because faster doesn't give them a lot of time to think about it. It's like, okay, don't get in your head. Don't ask me what a parsec is. Just say it. And if Harrison Ford doesn't have time to question, well, what the hell's a parsec, George? He's just going to say it, and the audience automatically interprets it. Oh, okay, it's a unit of speed. It's not, but but when we watch actual Star Wars, everybody's like, oh, okay, he made it in that speed. That's what Harrison Ford understood that to be. That's what George Lucas intended it to be. Doesn't matter that it doesn't mean that. That's how we comprehend it when we're watching it. So the real trick with the dialogue, the action, all that kind of verbiage is making sure people grasp the concept, which I think is the biggest key in any kind of storytelling in general. If people don't understand what the hell you're talking about or what the hell you're doing, they tune out and you lose your audience. And while most artists are like, oh, well, I just had to do my art and who will get it. It's like, no, you're doing your art for a reason. You want to communicate with people. And if they don't understand, if I just come out here and I start talking in a made-up language and I don't add subtitles, well, I mean, I can infer. So like a Chewbacca, R2-D2. No one understands what the hell they're saying. There's no subtitles. But they were smart enough to have the actors who do speak English react, and it's like inferred dialogue, which is wonderful. That's a brilliant way of going about telling a story. But if you don't have the audience understanding, then you're completely done. So my advice to anybody trying to get into a screenplay is always, always, always make sure you know what the hell you're doing, like what the hell the scene is about, what your characters want, and then make sure you're delivering that message. And that's why I like to keep it concise. So like one scene, one conflict. Doesn't matter if there's a war going on, right? Everybody understands that the point of the war is for, okay, we want to kill all of these guys. Well, duh. But in this particular scene, we want to get over that hill. Okay, that's maybe 4 or 5 scenes. What's the problem in the scene we're watching now? Oh, there's an artillery, like a heavy artillery gun right there. We need to take that out or we're never getting over the hill. Yeah. That's, you know what I mean? It's breaking down and understanding very simplistic. This is what we're doing. So Saving Private Ryan, what are we doing? Well, we got to go get this guy and bring him home. Okay, how do we do that? Well, we got to get through here. Well, that's a problem. How do we do that? We got to get a map guy. We got to do this. And what each scene is focused. That's really the key to having your dialogue on point, is focusing. For me.
Absolutely. That makes a ton of sense to me, and I would definitely second that opinion as a comic artist, because focused dialogue means less word balloons, and less word balloons means readers can enjoy my artwork.
See, but now there's a conflict there for me, because in dialogue, you are able to reveal character in a way that sometimes action, like physical action, cannot. So
absolutely,
it is always bugged me. Have you ever seen the theatrical poster for Superman, the 1978 movie?
I don't remember what it looks. I've probably seen it, but I don't remember.
You probably have, but do you remember what the tagline is?
No. Please enlighten me.
Google it. I see your screen flashing.
Yeah,
and it's actually better.
1978 poster.
Yeah.
Original poster. Is
yeah. Once you see it, it's actually better if you see it, because you'll pronounce it, and then I can get into my spiel.
Okay, let me see if I can find it here. Images.
It's a very sky-centric poster with like a
Is this
streak.
it? Oh, okay. I think I found it. All right. You'll believe a man can fly. Is that the one?
Yep, that's the one. All right, so that's a tagline, right?
Yeah.
That could very easily be a line of dialogue. No?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Right? So I look at that and it bugs the shit out of me because Superman is like the apex superhero character of conviction. He is unfoundering, unshakable. He is literally steel. He's Man of Steel, right? Like that's the gimmick.
Yeah.
So when I look at that as an artist and as a wordsmith, we'll call me that, I see a contraction. You'll believe a man can fly. And I see that and I go, fuck you. Because I want that to say, you will believe a man can fly.
Yeah, I get what you're saying because going back to what you were saying, it feels like dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
It makes it a little bit less imperative.
Right. And when we're talking about a character like Superman,
yeah,
any other movie, I would let it go. But because it's Superman, he's very stern, very blunt, very, he's not so subtle. He's not very relaxed. He's Superman. No, this is the way it is. Truth, justice, and the American way.
Away from being, y'all believe a man can fly.
Right. Right, and that's almost parody. So for me, I look at that and I'm like, okay, we're not revealing character through the tagline. And that, to me, is how I look at the dialogue. And so if I had someone saying something like that, like if Perry Mason was talking about this, what's our headline for the newspaper tomorrow? And, Lois Lane goes, you'll believe a man can fly. Perry White needs to turn around and go, no, you will believe a man can fly. Because that's Superman. The entire thematic, it needs to echo. Like George Lucas talks about, it needs to rhyme. It's the poetic, blah, blah, blah. But that is the artistry that comes in through dialogue, is choosing when to use a contraction, when not to, when to blatantly lay out every single word because it conveys conviction. That's character. That's, you know what I mean?
That's a huge, that's something I think about a lot when I'm writing characters, is because there are definite, you can totally ruin the personality of the character if they're contracting all their words and stuff, because it defines a particular characteristic. Like somebody who doesn't use contractions might be somebody who is more precise with their language, wants to all their interactions with people is more about delivering information, and they may be less confrontational. Or they could be very confrontational, and like you were saying, they're very absolute in their terms, and they want people to understand exactly where they're at, so that there's no ambiguity. Right. Basically.
I like when characters break expectation with their dialogue. I think that's one of the best things that you can do. So like if somebody lays out an entire diatribe, like if hypothetically speaking, if John McClane was arguing with Hans Gruber in Die Hard, and he made like a philosophical plea to Hans as to why this is wrong and why he shouldn't do it, and da-da-da-da-da-da, and it goes on for like a 10-minute monologue, and then Hans Gruber just looks at him and goes, no. He doesn't argue back. Do you know what I mean? That is a revelation of character. It's like, no. I'm not going to debate this. This is my core. This is what I believe. Done. Period. But then you also have someone like Jack Sparrow, Pirates of the Caribbean, where it's like, okay, he's a pirate, he's a criminal, he's not gonna debate with me. Actually, Jack Sparrow has more comebacks to justify every single one of his actions. Every time people are like, you're crazy, he's like, or I'm fucking brilliant, I'm like a genius. And then they're like, well, maybe he is a genius because it worked. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, and that's when dialogue starts becoming fun, because you are revealing character, and it's that clash of, as we've talked before, subverting expectation. It's another way for you to do that with your character. So, like, if I'm writing a character, sometimes people will ask me when I'm writing characters, it's like, oh, did you write this character with this actor in mind? So I don't do that at all, but I do kind of in a back doorway do it. So people will be like, oh, did you write this for this actor? No. But when I wrote this character, I said to myself in my head, this character is like if these two other characters had a love child. And that's how I start. So like I talked before about, the jock athlete and the town drunk. Well, if I clash those two characters together, that makes this character. So I have a character in Haunted, the main antagonist, called the Greeter. He's a guy in skeleton makeup and a suit and top hat or whatever. And in my head, when I was writing him, all I could hear was two characters. I could hear the Heath Ledger's Joker, and I could hear Captain Barbossa from Pirates of the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. And I was like, those are the two characters that's what this character would sound like. He'd be kind of gravelly. He'd be kind of poetical with his words. He would be fucking with your head while he said it. He would be very 3 steps ahead of everybody else that's talking or whatever. And I could hear those characters mangled. And then I would start drizzling in other characters here and there. And I didn't want to get too heavy with it because then it's like, okay, now you're just chaotic. But I was able to find like a harmony it was almost like food or any other kind of sciencey shit where I'm like a little dash of this and a touch of that. But those characters are all similar in archetype. You know what I mean? They're antagonists. Yeah. They all have similar kind of motives and ways of executing it. So it was like, okay, I can hear it in my head. And that's what they would say in this moment. And that's how I would kind of do it. So I would advise writers not to write for actors. Do you know what I mean? Like I wouldn't write for Tarantino like writing, okay, all right, every single thing and have him talking about feet and shit like that. But I would think about whatever the character is that he's probably going to play and I'd be like, okay, this thing is like Han Solo, but he's also a little bit like, I don't know. What's a random character? Give me a random character.
What the hell is his name? Jack Barton from, I think that's his name, from Big Trouble in Little China.
Yeah. So mash those two characters together and it's like, okay, that's how this character would talk. And then occasionally, you'd be like, well, maybe I'll drizzle a little bit of Ferris Bueller in there. And it's like, all right, now you're making a character. Now this is something that I'm slightly familiar with, but I'm also creating something new. I'm taking everything that I love and I'm mizzling together. I'm putting different toppings on my pizza, baby. And that's how it's working.
And also, over time, as you write a character, there will be organic little synchronicities or things that just pop up over the course of redrafting or going further into the story, where it's like, oh, suddenly some of the more original aspects of that character begin to form, and that's just like that's the nature of the creative process. I really like where you start it from is to juxtapose or to take two elements of things you're familiar with so that you at least have a starting point.
Yes.
And then allow it to kind of morph and form over time as you get more used to it. And also as you see that character interact with the other characters in your script, because then you start to have all the...
What was the name of that cartoon? I want to say it was called Clone High, where they took like a Disney princess, and it was a cartoon. It was on Cartoon Network. It was they put like Ariel, the mermaid, but then they also had like another cartoon character from another, not a Disney story, like say Dexter's Laboratory, and then like Cat Dog, and it was like just like an all-star of their favorite cartoon characters.
I know what show you're talking about. It was on Comedy Central. It wasn't on Cartoon Network. It was like a reality TV show, but it was like all these different cartoon characters, I think.
Yeah.
And like it was dirty humor kind of stuff and
right.
whatever.
But it was like but they took existing characters that were almost, I think they were like public domain, but it was like what would happen if Dracula went to high school with the Little Mermaid? And that to me is how I kind of approach my character settings, where it's like, okay, I watch all these movies and I, TV shows, books, whatever it may be, and I fall in love with all these little characters, and I'm like, man, wouldn't it be great if those like characters shared a universe? And then I'm like, well, fuck it. If I can take the essence of that character and put it into my story and mix it with other ones. So like, in no fucking madman's dream would anyone say Captain Barbossa runs a Halloween haunt. Like, that's fucking out there. That's never gonna happen. But I took that kind of character and I put him in my thing. And then another character that I drizzled into that Joker Barbosa character was Willy Wonka. Because I'm like, on a rewrite, I was like, motherfucker, he's like taking them on a tour. This is Gene Wilder's Willy Wonka. And you know what I mean? So I have those two antagonists, those evil antagonistic characters, and then I have this fun protagonist type character who's just very jovial and witty and sarcastic and fun. And I threw that into the mix, and I'm like, wow, I took a bunch of my characters I love, made another character that I love. Like, at one point, I even designed a tattoo that I was going to get on my arm of a character that I made for a movie that hasn't been made yet. And that's when I started becoming not only proud of my work, but my work stood on its own, because until I just said this out loud right now, the only people that knew that character was an amalgamation of the Joker, Barbosa, and Willy Wonka was me and the actor who was playing him, Kyle Stango. That was it. I had talked to him about that, and then I said, those are where I based it off of. Take it where you want to, because Kyle is a kind of guy that's seen more movies than I have. Very artsy, fartsy kind of movies. He's really into like a lot of A24 type stuff. But I told him, I'm like, that was the basis layer where I put it in. Those are the kind of characters I was looking at. To work in whatever else you want now. Like, build from that. That was my creative process for that. So that way he had the starting point of where that dialogue was kind of sounding like, where I was obviously saying like, oh, he kind of talks like Tom Waits. And he was like, okay, I get that. So now he's going to start thinking about other characters who talk like the Joker and Willy Wonka and Barbosa and Tom Waits. And he's going to be like, oh, I saw this one movie where this guy talked with a gravelly voice. And I'm kind of seeing that now. And I don't think Andrew's seen that movie. But you know what? I can use that tool. And by the end product, the audience, the critics, my mother, doesn't matter who's watched the movie, nobody fucking knows that we ripped off all those things. We just took all those things that we love and we created something new. And that's where the dialogue starts becoming organic, because you get that innate feeling about what that character would say and do and how they would say it. But again, it does come back to those rules where you look at the character and you're like, how would they say this? What words would they choose? What education did they have? You know what I mean? What are they trying to accomplish in the scene? Are they, the greeter character in Haunted, I told Stango this, I'm like, he is constantly trying to confuse the main characters. He's trying to throw out riddles, and he speaks in flowery poetry, poetic type things, not because it's pretentious or artistic or whatever like that, but because he wants everybody going, what the fuck did he say? Oh shit, someone just got stabbed. And that's what his intent was, to throw them off their game, so they're thinking about, trying to figure out, what did he say? And they're not expecting the monster mutant to fall out of the tree and kill somebody. That was the motivation behind the character. So it all starts forming together, and then it's kind of expressed through the character's mouth. I don't remember what the original question was, but that's my process when I come towards my dialogue, folks. So when you're watching one of my movies and you're like, that character kind of sounds like this character, chances are you're probably on point. I'm not ripping it off. I'm not even paying homage, but that was definitely a base point that I worked up from, if that makes sense.
No,
so
I like that process a lot, and I think that it's not quite my process.
I was just about to ask, what do you do when you're creating your process? Because every artist has their own version.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. Instead of characters from movies, it's often characters from my actual lived life that end up turning into characters. But I will definitely take characters from media that I really enjoy, and sometimes I merge those with people from my real life, right?
That's good.
And I usually go with people from my lived life, just because I remember the dialogue better from conversations that I've had and stuff like that. And so, because I'm sure you're similar in this way. I'm sure a lot of artists do this, where they just like listen in on conversations. Right?
Oh, absolutely.
And just
it's not so much eavesdropping as it is people watching.
Yeah, exactly. It's
Yeah.
people watching because you're kind of just like observing what things that people say, conventions and speech, or you'll hear things people say where it's like, oh, that's an interesting way of saying the way that they said that, and then, and then and inevitably get caught up in the conversation and start wondering all these questions that go into it of like, you know,
Yep.
uh, oh, did this person really say what I think they said? But anyway, point being, yeah, I think that that's my process right now. And actually listening to you talk about like doing the mixed cereal bowl of like, characters from media, that's something that now I kind of want to do for a story just to kind of.
It's so much fun
Yeah,
because it's
exactly.
that every artist sits there and goes, "Man, I would really like to work on a Star Wars movie." But you're never most of us are never going to get to watch to make a Star Wars movie. But you can sit there and go, "You know what? I'm going to backdoor this. I'm going to base my main character off of Luke Skywalker." And then I'm going to, change some things. I'll even admit it right now. I've talked about The Indomitable Spirit on here. It's a martial arts movie about depression, right? And I'm gonna out myself right now. It is my closet Superman movie. That's what the fucking movie is. It's Superman dealing with depression, and I strip away the superpowers and this and that, but the philosophical core that the characters are struggling with and arguing out, the philosophies that they're conflicting with one another, are very much what I would do if I was given the rights to Superman, Lex Luthor, and so on and so forth. That's the way I look about it. But, I can make Lois Lane commit suicide in the movie or whatever like that, and no fanboy is going to ridicule me because it's not actually Lois Lane. You know what I'm saying? So I can kind of hijack these beloved characters and do my own thing and tell it in my own vehicle. And that's really what storytelling is. You talk about archetypes. That's really what it is. There's, the hero with 1,000 faces, and we talk about these kinds of things. That's all that, Superman or, Michael Myers, all these characters, same character down at their core. I dare anyone to differentiate to me a character who is not an existing character of another one, or an amalgamation of 2 or 3 or 4 characters. Like, people look at like Jason Voorhees, right? The serial killer with the hockey mask, and he's got his mom and this and that. Tell me that is not a collaboration of Michael Myers and Norman Bates.
For sure.
It's just the love child of those 2 characters. And nobody says he's a rip-off or this or that. No, because it's an amalgamation of characters that someone loved, and it's as simple as that. And it works. That's how we get these things that we love. And I'm pretty sure if I got to do some of the films that I'm working on, like if once they come to life, some people are going to fall in love with them for the same reasons they fall in love with those other characters, and that's okay. That's not being unoriginal, in my opinion. And in fact, that's the whole point of creativity. It's not unoriginal to use the colors red and blue to make purple. Do you know what I'm saying?
Also, I also would say that's the skill. The skill is combining those 2 things together and then actually making it work. Because you could combine those 2 things together and it totally just sucks. Because it's so obviously that combination. It's just like the way that, when it doesn't work, the way that the artist has combined the 2 things, it just literally looks like there's a split down the middle. Like you just, took 2 clay models and mashed them together.
Right.
Because you do have to. I think as part of that process, what you end up doing is you have to actually find the commonalities they have, but then also be aware of the internal contradictions that they might have, and then meld it together in such a way that either the internal contradictions work or they're no longer apparent or obvious or, part of the bag.
Or do they tie in with what your theme is or what your story point? You know what I mean? Like that's where it's the same thing with dialogue. When you're looking at it, you say, well, if that's not revealing theme and it's not revealing character and it's not pushing the story forward, why is it fucking there? Like there, you know what I mean? Like you really need to be selective with that. And it goes back to, I believe it's Shakespeare quote, brevity is the soul of wit. Where it's just like, get to the fucking point, man. I'm not here for 6 hours. This isn't Lord of the Rings. I've paid my $11.50. I'm here for 90 minutes to an hour and a half or 2 hours. Get to the point, man. Let's go. And that's really how it should be. And then this is kind of the last thing that I wanted to talk about in regards to dialogue. It's also something that can be used to inflict pacing. Do you know what I mean? So we were talking about before about like Hans Gruber just saying no, contrasted against like a giant monologue or something like that. Yeah. You could also have one word exchanges. Yes, no, maybe, okay, really?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind are like Simon Pegg and Nick Frost movies. The pace of those movies, like Hot Fuzz or fucking Shaun of the Dead, it's one of the parts of the pace, right, is the editing, but another major part of the pace is the dialogue and how quickly the dialogue is exchanged between characters.
Yes.
And those things go hand in hand with each other, right? Because it's like that's what it creates the pace, but then it also creates the excitement and the humor too. A lot of the humor of those movies are largely based on that fast-paced dialogue and that like there's always stuff coming at you, right?
Yep.
But I'm sorry, what were you saying, Joe?
Oh no, that was the point I was making, is that you can if your story's starting to drag, like that's a common problem that people will feel like. I just start looking at it and I'm like, well, cut down on the dialogue. You have this you have 3 sentences coming out of this character's mouth. How can you sum that up in one word? And like I'll pose, like I go back to my writers group, I'll pose those challenges to my fellow writers. I'm like, well, they're like, oh, well, I feel like this is dragging here. I'm like, okay, see this giant monologue? Sum it up in one word, just one word. And you know what I mean? Like that will change the pace of how your story is going. And then all of a sudden it becomes a different story. It's like one of those reasons why, I don't know if you've ever watched the Supercut on YouTube. There's so many supercuts these days because tropes are fucking 80s, man. But like there's that one dialogue trope where someone's always like, you just don't get it, do you? And then they start spilling out the giant monologue or whatever like that. But they always lead into it with, you just don't get it, do you? And someone did that in my writers group and I couldn't believe it. It was like low-hanging fruit for someone like me. And I literally sat there and I said, you know what? We're about to take our break. Why don't you sit there and instead of you just don't get it, do you? Just sit there, take a pen and pencil, write 5 different ways to say the same thing. 5 different ways. Don't say you just don't get it, do you? And they were like, all right, whatever. They only got 3, I think it was. But when they did, we as the group picked out like number 2 or 3 or whatever. And we were like, that is a original, unique, but it says the exact same thing. And it's a better way to say it, and no one's going to roll their eyes or be bored or whatever like that. So you can always look at something and say to yourself, well, how do I say this differently? How would my character say this? How would one of the characters that I'm basing my character on say it? How would that guy that I know at the deli say this? You know what I mean? And
going back to Shakespeare, that's why so many people ended up liking Shakespeare as a playwright, is because he says a lot of, if you boil down the language, saying a lot of basic shit, but the way that he says it is either eloquent or uses metaphor in such a way that you're like, oh, I never really thought of it in that way. I never thought of that sort of what's the word? I never thought in this sort of visual style of language, like to be or not to be is. Everybody kind of knows that line, but nobody realizes until they actually read the whole soliloquy that it's like Hamlet's contemplating killing himself.
Yeah.
Usually just think about those lines as just like, it's just almost like music. You don't think of anything beyond just the music of the words. But then when you actually read it, it's like, oh, okay, if I were to boil this down, like Hamlet's just really thinking about, should I kill myself? What happens after, I die? Well, I don't know, so I guess not. And that's literally like, know, if you really wanted to boil it down, you could do it like that, or you could do it like Shakespeare did, where he's just, he's throwing bars, basically. I mean,
but there is something to be said about that. Like Aaron Sorkin is one of my heroes, and he's one of the writers who's revered for his dialogue because he's very monologue heavy, but he does it in a way where everything is pointed. It's not a grand gesture. Like he's just moving from point to point to point to point to point to point, and he's hitting you. So much so that he makes several points in one monologue, and then several counterpoints in the next monologue, and then 2 scenes later there's another monologue, and the actors, like, he'll write like a 90-page script, and then the end like television episode will end up being 45 minutes because the actors have to talk so much faster and to get out all these points, but it becomes highbrow. Like, people are like, this is moving so goddamn fast that he's making all of these so well thought out points that, yeah, he spent 6 months writing this script, but I'm watching this and digesting it in 30 seconds. It's almost too intellectual for me. Like, I need a minute. I need to step back and breathe here. And things like that can really help elevate a script, is when you've really tightened it, not so much for the word count, but for the content that you're delivering, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
If you could, because like you said, it's the opposite of Shakespeare. Shakespeare took a very basic thing, should I kill myself, and made it this grand soliloquy, and it's very musical and poetic and this and that. It's very romantic and beautiful. Whereas you could dumb it down the other way. And that's a choice that the artist or the storyteller needs to make when they're doing it. It even comes down to the acting when they're delivering it. You could say, to be or not to be. That is the question. And then on the other hand, you could just be like, have the same actor go, to be or not to be. That's a question. And you know what I mean? Like, the pace changes. And it's one of those things that where, again, as a writer, you need to kind of psychiatry your director and actor and the editor to some extent to make sure that they don't butcher your dialogue. But I think unless you have anything else, Mr. Rainwater, I think we're talking too long on Talkin. What do you think? Is there anything else that you wanted to ask or maybe talk about?
I think we're good. In fact, I was going to say the heavens outside.
It has been lightning behind you for the last 20 minutes, and I've been so worried that we were going to lose connection with you. But
right?
All right, so we'll wrap up our talking, but I think at some point we should revisit this a little bit more, because I think there are other dialogue techniques, and we can talk a little bit more about style and this and that. That I think this is one of the fundamental things that storytellers in general like to learn about. So I think we will come back to this topic in the future. I would definitely like to talk with this topic, because dialogue, I think, is the equivalent to lyrics. Yep. So I would like to talk to some of our musical friends about how they're composing lyrics, especially because how that applies to the music and the content, and how they're coming up with, if we have any hip-hop aficionados or rappers out there outside of me, because I used to be a rapper. I would love to talk with some people about that, because I think there's a thought process that goes into that. There's some artistry about lyrics that should definitely be examined, because I think that kind of stuff, like you were kind of talking about, that can carry over into other forms of storytelling, that musical aspect. So we'll come back to that. But for this episode, folks, thank you so much for tuning in. I am Jow. You can always check me out on Twitter at the Anjow, TheAnjow. Hit me up. Talk about the particular episodes that you've listened to. Tell me what you'd like us to hear, or like to hear us talk about. And we will wax poetical about that. Mr. Rainwater, if you want to plug yourself, feel free right before you get electrified by the lightning.
If you want to, also, if y'all want to talk to me about dialogue, you can include me in the conversation. It's at Matt J. Rainwater. It has been good hanging out, Jow, and let's do this again soon.